Before Greenwood, before Tulsa, before the smoke and the ruins and the graves, there was greatness. Black greatness. Born in chains but not defined by them. This story doesn't begin in Oklahoma. It begins on plantations, in cabins, in whispered songs and coded messages under the stars. It begins with men and women who had everything taken, yet found a way to build everything back with nothing. In 1865, when the Emancipation Proclamation finally made it to the last enslaved black people in Galveston, Texas, they walked off the fields free, but not fed, not housed, not clothed, not protected, not paid. Yet those freed people walked off with something far more dangerous to white America: hope, skill, community, a mind of their own. In the decades that followed, black people founded more than 50 all-black towns and cities across America, especially in the South and Midwest. Mound Bayou, Mississippi, founded in 1887 by Isaiah Montgomery, a former slave of Jefferson Davis. It became a thriving town with its own schools, hospital, post office, and businesses. A place where black doctors treated black patients and where black children learned from black teachers. Boley, Oklahoma, once home to over 4,000 black residents and multiple banks. Langston, Oklahoma, Taft, Redbird, Rentisville, Clearview, Lima. Each town was a fingerprint of freedom, a rebellion against the plantation. These weren't just homes. They were proof that black people didn't need white governance to build greatness, that we weren't inferior, that our brilliance, when not shackled, could shine like gold. It was economic independence, political autonomy, cultural pride, and that terrified white America. Because in a world that told them black people were meant to serve, to be grateful for crumbs, here were black folks creating castles from ashes. Tulsa, Oklahoma, early 1900s, a rough and rugged oil boomtown built on stolen indigenous land, chaos, and the promise of fortune. But on its north side, something different was growing, a dream with black skin. They called it Greenwood. It began with Ottawa W. Gurley, a black landowner, educator, and visionary who had migrated from Arkansas. In 1906, Gurley bought 40 acres of land on the north side of Tulsa, land he sold only to other black people. He wasn't just buying land, he was planting a flag, and what grew there would become one of the most advanced, self-sufficient, prosperous black communities in the world. Let the facts speak. By 1921, Greenwood had over 300 black-owned businesses, 2 movie theaters, including the Dreamland Theater, a public library branch, 30 restaurants, dozens of shops, and more than 15 black millionaires. Black doctors, dentists, lawyers, teachers, barbers, real estate agents, a black-owned hospital, a black newspaper, a private school, mansions lining Negro Wall Street built by black architects. They called it Negro Wall Street. Later, the world would call it Black Wall Street. The economic engine of Greenwood wasn't just oil or land, it was circulation. A dollar circulated in the community 36 to 100 times before leaving. That's economic power, economic defiance. And it wasn't just wealth, it was style, elegance, swagger. Women walked the streets in fine hats, silk gloves, and tailored dresses. Men wore 3-piece suits and owned multiple properties. Children attended school year-round and spoke of becoming lawyers and leaders. Greenwood was what freedom looked like. And yet, just a few blocks south, white Tulsans lived in slums. How could that be? How could descendants of enslaved Africans outbuild their former enslavers? That question burned, and the answer wasn't, let's learn from them. It was, let's destroy them. Because Greenwood was not just a town, it was a threat. A living, breathing contradiction to white supremacy. And when white supremacy feels threatened, it responds with violence. Let's talk plainly. White America didn't just dislike black progress, it was offended by it. They looked at Greenwood and saw something unforgivable. Black people thriving without them. This was post-World War I America. Thousands of black veterans had returned from the trenches of Europe. They had fought for a country that still lynched them, but they came home with a new spirit. They were no longer just field hands or sharecroppers. They were soldiers, trained, armed, proud. Many of them settled in places like Greenwood, places that offered safety, dignity, and opportunity. But across America, white resentment was festering. In 1919 alone, known as Red Summer, white mobs attacked black communities in Chicago, Illinois, Washington, D.C., Knoxville, Tennessee, Omaha, Nebraska, Elaine, Arkansas, where over 200 black farmers were slaughtered. Why? Because black people dared to ask for fair pay, because they joined unions, because they were building communities outside of white control. This wasn't just racism. This was organized, systemic backlash to black excellence. Newspapers across the country published inflammatory stories, false accusations of rape, of arrogance, of uppity Negroes. Politicians blamed black voters for social unrest. White mobs were emboldened and protected by law enforcement. And Tulsa? Tulsa was a ticking time bomb. The poorer white residents of Tulsa hated what they saw in Greenwood. Nice homes, black-owned cars, black maids working for black employers. White men who couldn't find jobs would walk past black doctors and feel humiliated. White women would see black women dressed finer than they could afford, and envy turned to rage, as one survivor put it. They weren't angry at what we did. They were angry that we didn't need them to do it, and so they waited for an excuse, one spark. And in May 1921, they got it. Every massacre in American history has a lie at its center. For Tulsa, that lie began in an elevator. 17-year-old Dick Rowland, a black shoe shiner working downtown, entered an elevator in the Drexel building. Inside was 17-year-old Sarah Page, a white elevator operator. What happened next depends on who you ask. Some say he tripped and grabbed her arm to steady himself. Some say the elevator lurched and she screamed. Some say they were lovers in secret, hiding from a racist world. But here's what didn't happen. There was no assault, no rape, no crime. There was only a scream. And in 1921 America, a black man did not need to do more than exist near a white woman to be marked for death. Rowland fled the building. Page didn't press charges, but the white-owned Tulsa Tribune saw an opportunity. That same evening, they ran a front-page story, titled, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." There was a second article on page 2, now mysteriously lost to history, titled "To Lynch Negro Tonight." The headline was all it took. By nightfall, a white mob of hundreds surrounded the Tulsa courthouse, demanding Rowland be handed over and lynched on the spot. But Greenwood wouldn't have it. Black veterans, men who had fought for a country that still spat in their faces, said, "Not this time." 30 armed black men marched to the courthouse to protect Rowland. They wore their uniforms, carried their weapons, held their heads high. One white man stepped forward and demanded a black veteran hand over his gun. He refused. A shot was fired. Then a pause. Then hell broke loose. What followed was not a riot, not a clash. It was war. The streets of Tulsa exploded. By the time midnight struck, white mobs had been armed by city officials. Some were deputized on the spot and told to get a gun and get a nigger. That is not speculation. It is documented. The Tulsa police enabled the massacre. The Oklahoma National Guard enforced it. And ordinary white citizens, men, women, even children, joined in. By dawn on June 1st, Greenwood was under siege. Hundreds of white men flooded into the district. They looted black businesses, torching them as they went. They dragged black residents from their homes, shooting them in front of their families. They raped women. They murdered elders. They shot babies in their mothers' arms. Survivors described bodies stacked like firewood. Churches were burned to the ground. The Mount Zion Baptist Church, a cornerstone of the community, was destroyed with dynamite. And then came the skies. Yes, the skies. Private planes, owned by white Tulsans, took off from nearby airfields. They flew low over Greenwood, dropping turpentine-soaked rags and kerosene bombs. Eyewitnesses saw them fire from the air. One survivor said, "We thought it was the end of the world. The sky rained fire, and the streets ran with black blood. By the end, 35 city blocks of black excellence were reduced to ashes. 1,256 black homes gone. 300 to 500 black people dead or disappeared. Thousands more displaced and homeless." But that's not all. Thousands of black survivors were rounded up by the National Guard and forced into internment camps. Yes, internment camps, complete with barbed wire fences and armed guards. You won't read that in most school books. They were not rescued. They were not protected. They were imprisoned while their homes burned behind them. This was not a riot. This was not spontaneous. This was a coordinated campaign of racial terror. After Greenwood burned, Tulsa didn't just bury the bodies. It buried the truth. Survivors, traumatized and homeless, were blamed for their own destruction. Insurance companies denied claims citing riot exclusions. Over $1.8 million in property damage never repaid. City leaders refused to provide aid. White newspapers never covered the aftermath. No memorials were built, no national headlines, no day of remembrance. Tulsa pretended like Greenwood had never existed. Even worse, they started rewriting the story, calling it a Negro uprising, saying black folks attacked first, claiming Greenwood had weapons stockpiled for rebellion. Lies. Decades later, survivors would speak out saying, "They wanted us to disappear." And for a while, we did. Tulsa public schools didn't teach the massacre for over 75 years. Most Americans didn't even hear the words Black Wall Street until the 1990s. How do you erase the destruction of 35 blocks of a city? You own the textbooks. You control the press. You cite the dead were hidden. To this day, mass graves are still being discovered. In 2020, archaeologists uncovered a site with dozens of unmarked coffins, likely massacre victims dumped and covered quickly before the world could ask questions. Greenwood's erasure was almost complete, but the people, the memory, they endured. For decades, the men and women who lived through the horror of 1921 carried the truth in their bones. They were children when their homes were burned. They were teens when they saw mothers violated and fathers gunned down. They were toddlers when the world turned red and black and fire rained from the sky. And yet, they remembered. Viola Fletcher, born in 1914, was just 7 years old when the massacre happened. At 107, she stood before Congress in 2021 and said, "I will never forget the violence. I hear the screams. I see the smoke. I live with it every day." Hughes Van Ellis, her younger brother, also testified. A World War II veteran, born in a burning Greenwood. He said, "We are not just black. We are Americans. But this country has failed us again and again." Leslie Benningfield Randall, another survivor, remembered running with her grandmother through a hail of bullets. She recalled stepping over dead bodies and never being allowed to talk about it again. These people were never paid, never compensated, never offered therapy, not even a formal apology from the US government. Instead, they were told to move on. But they didn't. They fought. Through memory, through truth, through raw, unapologetic testimony. They sued the city of Tulsa. They stood before national cameras and told their stories.